Afternoon, everyone. Bang on midday. Thank you so much for joining us, wherever you are joining us from. Just to let you know, we are recording this session, but really excited to be here launching these reports today. My name is Kester Bruin. I am Associate Director at the Institute for the Future of Work, where I help lead on communications and training development. And really delighted to have a panel with us to talk about the launch of these fantastic reports. The first person we're going to hear from is Mark Franks, Director of Welfare at the Nuffield Foundation. Mark leads the team responsible for the Foundation's welfare research portfolio and has also held a number of economist roles within government and the public sector. And we're hugely grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for funding the Pissarides review into the future of work and wellbeing, which has a bunch of has had input into all of these three papers. The third paper on pay also been produced in support by support with Digit and UKRI. So many thanks for that. Also on the panel is Dr. Magdalena Safir, who's our Associate Director of Social Research at IFOW, who has done a lot of the work around this work stream on work and well-being, and Professor Gillian Scordis, who's Professor of Economics at UCL, specialising in health and development. And Gillian designed this work stream for the Pissarides review. Really fantastic to have her expertise here. And joining us from York, but from the University of Leeds, we've got Professor Danat Valazade, who's Professor of Quantitative Economic Research. So really excited to get stuck into this. Before we do that, just a few opening words from Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Kester. So I've got the easy job today because it will be others who are bringing you up to speed with the findings from the exciting new research. But I'm going to speak briefly about some of the wider context for the topics you'll be hearing about today, and the Nuffield Foundation's motivation for funding the Pissarides review, as these things are closely linked. So the Foundation is independent, and we fund and undertake rigorous research, and we support the use of sound evidence to improve people's lives and to address the inequalities, disadvantage, discrimination and vulnerabilities that people face. And we're interested in how we can build a society that's prosperous and fair, and where people are secure and can fulfil their potential. And work is fundamental to these topics, both as a source of financial security, but also in providing an enhanced sense of purpose and belonging. And many of us, of course, spend a large proportion of our waking hours at work, so it's unsurprising it has major impacts on our physical and mental health and our family life and our interaction with our communities. Yet at the beginning of the Pissarides review, we didn't know nearly enough about the implications of work for the people doing it, let alone how workers, employers and policymakers should respond to its changing nature. And the key insight from the work of the review is that technologies combine to affect different jobs and therefore different people in different ways. So, for example, wearable workplace technology might be empowering if it helps to do your job more efficiently, but it will be less so if it's been used to monitor your work and increase its intensity. So just as jobs aren't randomly distributed across places or social groups, neither will be the impacts of technology on people's well-being. And all of this feeds through to people's productivity. I believe it's one of the reasons why earnings and productivity diverge so widely across the UK. And these inequalities are both bad in themselves, but they're also entirely inconsistent with an economy achieving its maximum potential. So if people have the skills to do their jobs well, supported by the management practices and investment being in place to use those skills, we can achieve positive outcomes for both worker well-being and the economy. And the Pissarides review has shown that while there are clear regional differences in readiness to embrace new technologies, the regional productivity gaps we currently see don't need to be as big as they are. Although it was an important landmark, the publication of the Pissarides review main report a year ago was not the final word in understanding these issues. Such valuable and unique data was collected for the review that the opportunity to use it further and to combine it with other data sources was too good to miss. So we're delighted to have been able to support supplementary work doing that, and you'll be hearing more about that today. So, for example, it looks at the relationship between AI adoption and earnings and productivity, with some potentially encouraging results. But the work once again shows the vital roles employers have to play in introducing new technologies in the right way and supporting labour market mobility. So since the publication of the review last year, the team have been hugely active and successful and increasingly recognised in developing the insights and networks that the review has helped to build to maximise its potential for real-world impact. And these new findings will support those efforts further. So you'll want to hear more about it, as do I, so I'll now hand over to colleagues for the panel session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That's a really fantastic introduction. And just to give a little bit more context in terms of an overarching narrative to cover all of this, what we're really talking about here, as in the title, is that when we're thinking about the future of work, what we're understanding now is that it's not predetermined by the technologies that are being pushed out there. It's actually shaped by the institutions in terms of workplaces, whatever. And that's extremely important for us to understand how this kind of future of work is evolving, that it's not just about us accepting a future given to us by technology companies. It is about shaping how those are adopted through the institutions, and that's really about culture and values. So rather than asking whether technologies like AI, automation, or digital monitoring will affect work, the evidence shows they already are, by shaping pay, job quality, labour market mobility, and well-being in concrete ways. But these impacts are neither predetermined nor are they evenly distributed, as discussed. And a consistent pattern is emerging across workplaces. Technology doesn't act alone in implementing these changes, and institutions play an active and vital role in shaping the outcomes of tech adoption. The way that our organisations are governed, how workers are supported, and whether worker voice and participation exist, all mediate how technological change is felt by workers across the labour market. So there are three key papers that we're going to be talking about here. The first of them has been exploring, for the first time at an individual level, measuring labour market frictions among UK employees. The second one is called To Help and to Hinder, which is how HR policies and support are supporting individuals to use new workplace technologies. And the third one, produced in association with the Digital Research Centre, is on AI and how that's been impacting pay. So first of all, how are kind of the outcomes of technology adoption landing unevenly across the workforce? And Magda, I wonder if you wanted to speak briefly to the institutional moderators paper and talk to us a little bit about that paper in general.
Sure. Thank you, Kester. Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and joining us. It's my morning here. I'm in Chile, so it's 9 a.m. But ready to introduce you to this paper. So yeah, I can speak to the To Help or to Hinder paper that you just mentioned. So we ask, and we use a similar data set to all across these three papers. In this particular case, we asked nearly 5,000 employees across the UK whether interacting with new different workplace technologies has led to any changes in their daily job experiences. And we asked them about changes in aspects that we would consider comprising good quality jobs. So we asked them about changes in task repetition, for instance, which is a sort of a proxy for skills use, on flexibility to choose their work setting, which we know drives a big part of what we call work-life balance perceptions. We asked them about changes in job security, the perceived likelihood of losing your job and their job in the short term, the next 6 months, due to technology or not. And we asked them about as well sort of learning opportunities and opportunities to apply and use their own ideas. So this is just a selection of a series of I think it's nearly 20 different aspects of job quality that we asked them about, and whether they've changed through because of technology. And just as the a hint and trying to answer your question around how this is looking in practice in terms of varied outcomes. We found that the changes reported by employees can go in opposite directions, first of all. So in relation to how beneficial they could be for well-being. So it's not that technologies are consistently improving the experience of work or consistently harming those experiences. It's more like we can have a little bit of both things. So for example, we observed that a significant proportion of employees would report an increase in their opportunities to learn new things through technology, but at the same time they would report increased task repetition, for instance. So it's a little bit like you can have the benefits of it without a little bit of cost as well. That's how the picture looks initially. More notably, but this impacts on different aspects of job quality, as well as we ask about quality of life overall. So that was also one of the outcomes we measured. And we noted that these vary a lot depending on the type of technology we're asking about. So for instance, regular exposure to digital ICTs, which we know is the mostly widespread technology nowadays, was consistently associated with positive changes, including more flexibility, of course, as we know, remote working, more possibilities to learn new things helped by technology, to use your own ideas, increased job security as well, and a consistent increase in a positive association with overall quality of life. In contrast, though, when we started asking about more modern or newer technologies, wearables, for instance, so remote tracking sensors and things like that, were linked to more negative outcomes like task repetitiveness or lower job security and overall worse quality of life scores. Similarly, software using AI and machine learning was found to help workers with flexibility and idea use, but also linked to lower job security and quality of life. So in the sense, they have something sharing with digital technologies, with digital ICTs, but also bad outcomes sharing it with wearables. We also asked about robotics. There weren't very clear patterns in the use of robotics, probably because of these are much more sector specific, and we're talking in overall average terms. But I mean, if there was something to know there was also a slight decline in quality of life. So corresponding with what we would call like newer, more modern technologies in the workplace. So in practice, Kester, very mixed outcomes, as you said, across the board. That's what we got with the HR paper.
Thank you, Magda. That's really, really fantastic. And those different outcomes across different technologies, so important. I'm going to bring in Professor Gillian Scordis in a second to speak to the work on frictions. There's been quite a lot of discussion about this recently. I know that there was a piece in the FT talking about whether frictions are a good or a bad thing in life in general, but also in the labour market. You know, we see a very kind of low friction thing in one sense in terms of being able to apply for hundreds of jobs at a time. But this is speaking very particularly to different sorts of frictions in terms of you know, people's ability to move between roles or move between different jobs. And this is the first time, I think, Gillian, that this work has actually been done in terms of employee-specific work on measuring frictions. Could you tell us a little bit more about that paper? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, Kester. And this was both exciting and challenging because, like you say, this was the first time that this Nobel Prize-winning framework, which was a theoretical framework, had been applied to empirical data. So what does it mean in real life? How do we interpret real life? We all know that the UK is grappling with issues of low productivity, rising unemployment, underemployment, and that's not equally spread across age groups or across regions in the country. And that's possibly why it's getting quite a lot of attention. And so we wanted to use this frictions framework with the support of the Nuffield Foundation to think a little bit about not only how we can think about movement in and out of work, which is what the original Mortensen-Pissarides framework was aimed to do. So why do we have unemployment? But also to look at underemployment. So how people might move between jobs in the same organization, or how they might adapt to changing roles within their current job. So quite a broader frame than the theory was originally designed to do. But that's been incredibly helpful, because what we've been able to see is that there are frictions that are not good, i.e. they stop people from really adapting to the new roles that they might have to or want to take on. They also stop people adapting fully to the roles, to their own roles as they transition to a new skill set. And that means that we're depressing productivity from where it should ultimately be. So in this instance, friction is the bad that stops us from reaching either a productivity high, or we also looked at worker well-being in another study published elsewhere, that well-being, satisfaction, workers are happy with their jobs, workers are thriving in their jobs. So what did we find then with this? We interviewed 4,000 workers across a number of sectors, and we found that a number of different frictions exist. The most common friction, probably unsurprisingly, is a geographic friction. It's not always easy to move for the right job, and finding local jobs can be a problem, particularly, I'm afraid, outside of the Greater London area. So we should be looking at strategies to decentralize a wider range of jobs, and to try and find multi-sectoral economies outside of our big city centres, Manchester and London, among two of our larger urban agglomerations. So those were two. That geographic friction is problematic. If you can't move for the right job, you have to settle for the wrong job where you live, and that means you are underemployed or underutilized in terms of your skill set. The other big friction is time constraints. I suspect everyone that's on this call understands what a time constraint is, and how we all have to do more with the time than we have, that we would feel comfortable doing. But this time constraint also affected people quite differently. So we do find older workers more affected by the time constraint, women more affected by this time constraint. And so what we start to see, and it's a picture I'll build with my next point, is that not everybody is equally affected by these frictions, which means, first of all, not only is it on aggregate holding back productivity and worker well-being, but it's widening inequalities. And so we're likely to see widening regional inequalities as a result. Digital skills mismatches and the importance of training, another set of frictions. And then what we see, to get back to my inequalities point, is an intersectoral set of frictions. So certain people are more likely to experience multiple frictions than other people, and then you're really stuck. So one of the things we observe certainly is that workers with low pay will be particularly vulnerable to a multiple set of frictions, including geographic and time and possibly digital skills amongst those. And of course, who is likely to be in low pay is not an equal or random thing. It's a non-random thing. So it will unfortunately underpin some of the widening inequalities that we may see in the UK economy if we don't act, because as Kester has said, this is not predetermined. We now know what the determinants are of these outcomes, what the risk factors are, and so we can act. One interesting thing, as somebody who's been in the same job for more than 2 decades, is that we discovered a stuck worker paradox. So information frictions, the ability to find new informations on great jobs, that is a friction that we did observe, that we did non-randomly observe. But if you've been in a job for a long time like me, you will have higher levels of information frictions. And who's likely to have been in jobs for very long periods of time? Older people. So again, we see that there might be gender, age, regional disparities in the experience of frictions, and that frictions can span geography, information, time, and other factors. It's not predetermined. There are things we can do, and possibly the most protective factor against all of these frictions is how companies and institutions arrange both their HR policies and training. So are people being trained to do the new job? So if your current job is changing in its nature, are you being given the resources and the training to believe and know that you can cope with that job? And if you're having to pivot to a new role, again, are you supported through that transition? That's absolutely key to you overcoming those frictions. And possibly, unsurprisingly, underneath that is not only the extent to which a company has those supported HR policies, but whether there's employee voice. So will employees be listened to if they're able to say, hang on, we haven't been trained, or this transition is happening too quickly. Can you support this cadre of workers? Can you think about the needs of this cadre of workers? So trade unions is one form of employee voice, but there are other forms of employee voice. So there are mechanisms to protect people, but there are risks if we ignore those mechanisms and if we just plow on as we are. Thank you, Kester. I think I'll leave that for others to discuss.
That was brilliant, and it's such a fascinating paper, and this idea of the policy element is just so important. Just interesting, the links with another work stream that was in the Pissarides review, which looked specifically at the firm level stuff, and there was a survey of 1,000 UK firms about their technology adoption processes, and that report, led by Professor James Hayton from Warwick Business School, showed also this idea of institutional support just being super important there. So it's great that different work streams from the review have been kind of supporting in each other in terms of those findings. I want to turn to Denat now, and Denat, it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about how this next work was done, this focus on AI and pay, and who was involved in that study and this work, because really fascinating. And of course, for many of us, the pay question is super important, particularly as these emerging technologies are moving so fast. If you could just tell us a little bit about the kind of origin of the paper, and also the data set, and then some of the findings there about how AI has been impacting pay. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. I mean, the origins of the paper is that we started thinking as part of Digit Research Centre about the ways in which we can measure and understand the impact of technology adoption, technology use, particularly kind of more novel AI-based technologies on worker outcomes. So what does it actually mean for an individual worker and the quality of their jobs if their employers use or adopt kind of more novel types of technologies? There are a couple of challenges around that. And one major challenge is that we don't really have a great deal of reliable data on both workers, but I think crucially employers, in terms of the actual extent of AI investment or AI adoption and worker use of those technologies. So that was one major barrier. And that's how we kind of came together to collaborate with the Institute for Future of Work, and both Magdalena and Jolene collaborated with us on this paper. We brought our own Digit employer survey, which is nationally representative across the UK, of about 2,000 employers, where we tried to understand whether organizations invest in AI, in which forms of AI, and what it means from organizational perspectives. And then we linked it, and I think it's quite crucial in terms of what Jolene was saying. We linked it by the intersection of industry, region, and firm size, right, to capture those regional disparities in AI adoption. So we aggregated our employer survey at that level to understand what are the patterns of AI adoption at the intersection of particular industry within a specific region, and given different firm size bands. And we linked it to the survey of employees done by Institute for Future of Work that measures, as Magda has said, measures how people use that technology. So we created that linked data set. And kind of the importance of that we were able, firstly, to measure directly whether people use AI technology and how frequently they do that. And then secondly, whether that matches what employers tell us. Okay, not at the level of individual organization, but at least at the level of sector, industry, and firm size. The reason why that is important, because a lot of economic evidence at the moment is based on vacancy data. that is easily available, and economists go and routinely study vacancy data. And don't get me wrong, there are great insights from that, and you can really track sort of the development of AI in the labor market, at least from the point of view of what organizations advertise. Now, the challenges with that are that, okay, you can get the sense of what employers want at any particular point in time. What you don't really know is what happens to people when they are at work, right? Do they actually use that technology? What are they actually paid when they are on the job? You can advertise whatever you want to, but what do you actually pay depends on people's skills and whether they actually use technology. And then, of course, we cannot then capture all those important institutional and organizational factors, like, for example, employee voice. So all of that is out of the equation if you just rely on vacancy data. And we try to look at that, again, from the point of view of individual use and organizational practices. We look specifically at pay, and pay is one of the core characteristics of job quality. Now, I will concede it's not the only one. And well-being, as well as job autonomy and some other characteristics, are important dimensions of job quality. It's not just about pay, but pay is one of the fundamental ones. And the question we're trying to ask is, now, when you implement AI technology and when people use AI technology, what does it mean for their pay more broadly? Now, secondly, and I guess more importantly, what does it mean for pay distribution? And by that, we mean a pay gap between lower and higher qualified workers. The reason why that question is quite interesting is because previous waves of technological change have led to what we call polarization of the labor market, where you have more traditional forms of ICT that, well, overall result in workers probably being better off in terms of their income, not necessarily well-being, not necessarily their levels of stress or autonomy, but on average, probably better off in terms of their pay. However, that is on average. In practice, ICT technology tends to favor more qualified and more skilled workers, whereas routine occupations in the middle or occupations that have lower levels of qualification requirements tend to get disadvantaged. So we have that gap and polarization in the labor market where workers who are higher qualified tend to benefit disproportionately from technology use and investment. So the question is, does investment in AI and does the use of AI have the same pattern, or we're going to see something different? And then obviously the third question that we asked is, do particular institutions, and looking specifically at the institutions of employee voice, matter for those effects? So it's one of those papers where you can talk a lot about why you've done it, but to summarize findings, you can do it in a couple of minutes. So in terms of pay, what we have found is that the AI use by employees, as well as the AI adoption by employers, both lead to higher levels of pay. So there is a positive correlation. Okay, correlation is not causation. There can be multiple other factors that contribute to that, but in principle, there is a positive association. So far, that is in line with what we know about technology. But when we start disaggregating data by the levels of qualification or occupational skill groups, we've done both formal qualification, but also occupational skill groups, you see one and the same pattern. And that is that workers at the lower end of qualification and occupation spectrum, we're talking about people with the lowest level of qualification or no formal qualification, as well as occupational skill groups that require lower levels of skills. They tend to benefit more from the use of AI than those at the upper end. So if you look at the most qualified workers, potentially there is some benefit, but it's quite marginal and it's quite linear, if you want. So they do tend to benefit, but that is to a smaller extent. And the progression there is quite linear. If you were to draw the line, it will be quite, not necessarily flat, but it will have a very narrow slope. And you can see that they benefit a bit from pay increase. Now, that's quite different from those at the lower end. The moment less qualified workers start using AI technology frequently, And by frequently, we mean most of the time in their day-to-day tasks or all of the time. They benefit much more significantly. So there is the jump in the curve in terms of their pay. So they benefit a lot more once they use technology frequently than people with higher qualifications. So that is quite different from what we knew about ICT technology. And what's the potential here? The potential here is that if you implement and use AI and workers use it frequently, then we can see the wage compression in the labor market, or put differently, more equal pay distribution. So that's the potential. That's not a foregone conclusion, because as everyone said before, the outcomes of technology are not predetermined, but there is potential here. Now, when we looked at the impact of voice, that potential seems to be much stronger in places where workers are involved in decision-making, and specifically decision-making around pay. In other words, where you have employee involvement, where there are mechanisms for people to get involved in decisions around pay, they benefit, or at least qualified workers seem to be benefiting more from the adoption of AI. That is not to say that voice is absolutely strictly necessary. We can't go that far in our findings, but it certainly is a very important, significant factor in making that relationship work between AI technology and pay distribution. So that's in short the summary of our findings. And we thought it's quite interesting that, well, firstly, we find the effect of voice, and voice is important, but also that it seems to be, at least at this early stage of adoption, technology adoption, quite different from what we know about previous waves of technological change. And the only caveat for me to finish here is that, again, getting back to where I started, that is just the impact on pay. That doesn't mean that the benefits of pay increase don't come with trade-offs, and trade-offs can be for work intensification, trade-offs can be for greater managerial control, lower job satisfaction. We don't know whether those trade-offs exist. What we know initially from those findings, and there is certainly potential in AI technology to increase pay, but also to provide more equal pay distribution.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Dana, and Julien and Magda, who were also involved in that paper with others, including Mark Stewart from Digit as well. Magda, I wanted to bring you back in, and because all of these papers have been talking about the role of institutions and the central role that they play, which in a sense, I find it quite an encouraging thing that these, corporations, that this kind of corpus of bodies together, of humans together, can actually have some good benefits. And I wonder if you wanted to speak a little bit to the role of organizational culture in helping specifically ideas around job quality.
Sure. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, Kester. What we've seen across these papers is it was a nice realization that very much aligns with the capabilities approach that we've been using throughout the Pissarides review as an informative, normative theoretical framework. And there's a concept in for those who are familiar or not with the capabilities approach, there's a concept of conversion factors within this approach. And we wanted to understand how institutions, as rules of the games, would fit under that idea of conversion factors. In a sense, these refer to key contextual settings or structural factors that help or hinder, as the title of the paper goes, the transformation of what we see to be resources or technological resources, how this can be transformed or converted into valued opportunities and real freedoms for workers to do what they wish to do, what they want to do in their jobs. So this is assuming basically that the earlier, all the observed preliminary outcomes that we've seen in terms of different technologies impacting aspects of jobs like pay, but also more intrinsic job quality features like your ability to use your own ideas, your level of autonomy, etc., it's assuming that these outcomes are not inevitable and that they basically shaped by different rules of the games, as you've said. So this is broadly how we understand institutions, right? Now, in the paper I'm speaking to help or to hinder, we place particular attention to the role of HR philosophies, which can span a full spectrum from those policies, organizational culture that are sort of employee-centered to those more efficiency-centered. So these are, we use a validated, well-established measure by LEPAG and others, asking, I mean, the novelty is that in this case, it was reported by employees themselves, how they perceive their organizational culture to be. And they would sort of gave their opinion in terms of whether the our organization takes care of their workforce, no matter what the business challenges might be, whether they invest in their employees because they know they determine the success of the business, and whether they maintain a long-term commitment with the well-being of their workers. So this is, if we would talk about a very supportive, strong employee-centered HR culture versus a much more productivity, efficiency-centered HR culture. So we wanted to see if the benefits or disadvantages brought about certain technologies on job quality would vary or were conditional to the HR organizational culture they were in. So we took those other 25% top most supportive HR settings versus the least supportive ones, and we compare if the outcomes change at all. Why we focus on HR philosophies? Because I mean, there are other sort of institutions that we explored in this data set, including training, including voice, as Danat has mentioned. But consistently, HR philosophy was the one that linked more strongly to the outcomes of interest, like quality of life overall, but also job quality. So we said, okay, let's see whether this might be having a moderating role or not. So we asked whether the outcomes observed above were conditional to the type of HR. And we did this through interaction analysis. So it's not too complex, and it's not, we're not proving any causation, as that said. This is just correlational analysis. But we found consistent and strong interactions between HR philosophy and digital ICTs. In the sense that the gains that we've said in terms of flexibility, more learning opportunities, job security, etc., were somewhat bigger for employees in settings with supportive and strong employee-centered HR philosophies. So those in poor HR settings, there was also a benefit observed from digital ICTs, but it was flatter, and it was quite a gap for those in more supportive HR settings. Notably as well, we found that HR philosophy plays somewhat a weaker moderating role when it comes to newer technologies like wearables, AI or machine learning based software or robotics, which led us to think that even supportive HR philosophy can fail to mitigate some negative impacts. And there might be different interpretations or reasons for that that we discussed in the paper. So it could be that sort of traditional HR policies are not yet aligned with the potential impact of this newer tech. So in a way, there's sort of a lag infrastructure or institutional setting to deal and manage the deployment and governance of these technologies, which in a way has been overcome already with digital ICTs because they've been in place for longer now. So that could be a reason. There could be that. I think it's also important to know that the HR function itself can be shaped by the use of this technology. So we know there are lots of HR and AI powered tools used nowadays to boost HR functions. And sometimes those the tools selected could be counterproductive. So there could be, this is a stretch of an example, but you might find a paradoxical rollout. So you have a very employee-centered organizational culture, and as part of that culture, we're going to deploy it. We're going to give everyone of our employees, I don't know, a smartwatch to track the physical health, the sleep quality, etc. Which is that the message could be embedded in a employee well-being narrative, but without enough awareness of the potential impacts and broader impacts of that kind of technology, we might be creating a completely different and unexpected effect, which is workers feeling more anxious about every task, feeling more repetitive tasks, lower autonomy to control every other movements, etc. So there might be something here that the same institution is being shaped by the technologies we deployed in the workplace, which is something we need to consider further.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Magda. Gillian, I wanted to just bring you in quickly because we'd also talked about training as a really important mediator here. Then we're going to get to some Q&A. So if people can start putting some questions in for our panel, that'd be great. But yeah, Gillian, be great to hear about the stuff on training.
Yeah, I'm going to be quite brief so that we can get to Q&As, because I'm curious to see what people have to ask. Training is a good thing. It generally increases the transferability of skills. And of course, as we go through this rapid digital transformation, a new set of skills are required, and that will often be within your same job. And I've certainly had to learn a whole lot of new stuff quite recently. But we found that effect is positive whether employers provide it or whether people get that training for themselves. I suppose all of this discussion, sorry, I'm gonna end up on a slightly more reflexive point if you'll allow me, Kester. Magda's really emphasized the importance of HR policies. I'm gonna bang on about the importance of in-work training and the role of employers in providing that training. But I'm really nervous that we're at risk of stepping back and going, it's all in the hands of the companies. If only companies do well enough by their employees, all will be well. And I think, first of all, that we can't rely on that as a policy reaction, because what are the incentives for firms to engage in providing more voice, providing more training? Training has a cost. Voice also has a cost. Are you just training people to leave you? That may have a whole set of transaction costs if you actually invest in people who then very hireable at the firm next door. So I think we need to think a little bit about how much we're emphasizing the role of individual firms without a wider policy environment, possibly government policy environment that facilitates that. I also want to mention that we are talking about firms, and I've absolutely done that in the bit that I've done. I think Danat's been a bit more nuanced than the rest of us, but talking about firms as though they're one thing. And of course, we know they're not. There's everything from really large scale firms with thousands of employees to micro enterprises that might be 3 or 4 people. Those micro enterprises might not have professional managers and HR functions. They're just trying to deliver a small product. And we rely on those micro enterprises for a lot of the productivity that we see in our economy. So I know you asked me to talk about training, and I've sort of not, but I think partly because already in my talk, I've said that training can overcome information frictions and skills frictions. So it's a good thing, but the question is, and it isn't addressed in our work sufficiently, and it's an agenda for the future, who should be providing that training? Thank you.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So a question just come in, which I'll field to you, Danat. Whether the potential benefits of AI for lower qualified workers closing that pay gap could be offset by the increased risk of redundancy that they might face if their job is replaced by AI or kind of changed in another kind of automation way. So is there any evidence that we're seeing a kind of offsetting there?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, not in our work, not at the moment. I think there are a couple of caveats here. Is there a risk that whatever benefits can be accrued to workers will be offset by job displacement? Yes, of course. I mean, we are at the very beginning of whatever you want to call it, AI revolution or the great agentic generative AI shift. We don't really know which way it's going to go, and we don't really know what technology is capable of. That's not about being technologically deterministic, but we just really don't know which way it's going to go. So it is possible. At the moment, the difference between the way AI works and operates compared to previous ways of technological change, go back to industrial revolution and from there, is that it doesn't necessarily, even though in some cases it doesn't necessarily replace the whole job altogether, right? At the moment, it helps automate particular bits of tasks that are part of one's individual job. And that's happening more frequently, the jobs being displaced on a mass scale. Now, can it result in a decline in the need for, say, lower entry or graduate level jobs? Potentially, yes. At the moment, I don't think there is strong evidence to back that. I think a greater risk, and I'll just go back to what Jolene was saying, the greater risk is how that technology is used, and the greater risk is to which end it has been implemented, and do we have an institutional framework that can mitigate some of the disadvantages of the individual power of organizations? Because the human resource philosophy, human resource practices, and treating employees well works well, and we know that, but it works well when the economy is growing or when the organization is doing well. The moment organizations are not doing that well and the overall economic climate declines, all of that goes, not all of that, and a lot of it goes out of the window, and organizations start behaving very, very differently. So what are the mechanisms that can counterbalance that? What are the institutions that can set at least some standards for technology adoption and use? Because if we know it doesn't happen, you can see very positive examples amongst more advanced firms, which are generally bigger in size and have established mechanisms of employee involvement. But there will be a lot of not necessarily micro, but say medium-sized firms who will just not have any of that. And the implications for workers will be very different. I think there's something we haven't touched upon yet, and maybe touching, Q&A and discussion, is human-centered AI, which we were talking about, and it's on the briefs. I think the reality is that most firms adopt AI to improve efficiency. That's what they tell us. They're not adopting it to make human lives better. They're not adopting it to benefit workers. They're adopting it to improve efficiency. That can have a very dark side, and institutions are quite important.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks really well to another question which has come in. Thank you. Please do keep posting those. And I'll field this to Jolene. We've said, or you've said, that we can't fall back on hoping firms will act. And Dana has said, firms are kind of obviously doing partly this, not just out of goodwill, but in terms of productivity and efficiency. What public policy avenues might be used to encourage good practice from firms?
Yeah, firms are not responsible for the delivery of our social welfare. Firms are profit maximizing institutions. So if we make them responsible for our social welfare, we're creating a mismatch in their whole incentive structure and their purpose. And we can't then be surprised if things don't work. So what are the policy institutions? Legal frameworks, possibly. So that's a bit of stick, but a bit of carrot, possibly. Incentives. Can we create? So I'm not saying that providing training or providing positive HR policies is a bad thing for firms and they won't want to do it because it's against their profit motive. But we possibly need to emphasize that in training your workers, yes, there's a risk you may lose them, but you'll also get more out of them in their current jobs. But because of that risk of losing them, perhaps firms shouldn't bear the full cost of paying them. So I think we really do need to look at training schemes and who bears the cost of training schemes. Can we create some form of lifelong learning fund that the government posited many years ago, and I'm not sure where we are with it, but can we give individuals some more control over that training? So that there are a lot of different strategies that we could be exploring. But I am a little worried, and I think Danat echoes this concern that if we push all this onto firms, we'll get very varied responses, and firms do not exist to deliver our social welfare programs. They also don't exist to create jobs. They create jobs where those jobs improve their productivity and their output and their profit margin. So we can't mandate that they create or protect jobs. We can mandate that the jobs they have are of a reasonable quality. So we mandate what we can, we create incentives, we work in partnership with firms, because the whole society benefits when we've got a productive society, where we've got innovation, where we have firms that want to invest, that want to grow here. So this is in all of our benefits, it's in all of our interests. But I don't think there's one silver bullet, if that's what I'm being asked for. I think what we need is a combination of how can we work together? What positive incentives can we put in place? And then how do we make sure that we set a floor that's monitored in law, and that we don't let our employees or our firms fall below?
Thank you. Gillian, yeah, I was asking for a silver bullet, and goodness me, we didn't get it. But of course, there isn't one. Just to point people, on the 26th of February, we've got another webinar actually focusing on particularly the questions around young people and access to good work, and some work that we've been doing at IFOW in collaboration with the EY Foundation on kind of improving receptivity for those young people who are kind of at risk of falling into that neat category about training programs and so on. But one further question that's come in is around, how do we know that the training that we use could have a decent return on investment, because the technology is changing so fast? I mean, I remember being trained in using an overhead projector in a school, and that was very, very high tech at the time. But these things, they're changing so fast. Magda, is there a sense that we know that training is worth it anyway, or is it a sense in which, do we have any measure of how effective that could be? Magda, and then Danat, and if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. So in this particular set of papers and analyses, we ask about different types of training, in the sense of whether they've been provided by the employer, whether they've been actively pursued by the employee themselves out of working hours, and some other options within that spectrum. There are different impacts depending on the technology as well. So we know training could be effective, as Gillian says. Sometimes it turns out to be to have a toll. So in many cases, especially with newer technologies, and this is we're getting insights from other projects done within the IFOW in partnership with CAPD as well, where we've been holding several interviews and workshops with different industries as case studies. And a message that we consistently get from them is that there's that sort of imperative to, when it comes to newer technologies, for employees to train themselves and to upskill themselves, because otherwise they're going to get out of the labor market. And there's not a reassurance by the organizations that they have been given that time within working hours, that they've been costed that time. So it's not even if they're provided by the employer, but whether they can secure that time. So it's become sort of a double working day in some cases. There was also a lack of a consistent message noticing the lack of feedback loops with managers, organizations, and training providers, what is effective actually. So there's a lot of self train self-provided training via the same platforms, LLMs and generative AI, but there's no feedback with technology developers and training providers on whether that training has been effective or not. So that's something a HR function could support with, etc. So establishing those feedback loops, not necessarily providing the training. There was also an interesting thing that so far, lots of the training is also provided by the developers themselves. So you as an organization adopting technology, and you're sure that the most effective way to train your workforce in that is that to get the training from the technology designer, which sometimes could be completely out of touch with what workers themselves need to get their grips of that technology and to use it for their own benefit and to improve their working flows. So there are lots of small tweaks that could be improved there to make training more effective. But as we've said throughout, I think it needs to be seen within the wider innovation ecosystem as well, and within the wider HR and function. So it's not just training; it's about establishing feedback loops and voice mechanisms to improve that training provision.
Just very, very quickly then, as we finish, I want to ask each of you, just for, if you did have a magic wand, if you did have a silver bullet, just for one policy recommendation that you would love to kind of throw back about, what would be the one thing, the one kind of key change, just in one sentence, please. Dana, let's start with you.
You're gonna do that. Start with me. And silver bullets. No idea. But I think if I were to do something, I would say, one, some job quality standards. Right. I mean, I don't know what the silver bullet is for AI adoption, but I know that setting standards of good jobs is something that the state can do as an actor without necessarily extending its presence in every area and nationalizing everything. That doesn't need to happen, but the state can set the standards. And the other thing is probably less of a policy, but more the direction of travel, and that is about skill utilization. And I think training is fine and it works, and we know it works, but it only works so long as there is skill utilization in place. Those skills got to be applied, and that's what the state should think about.
Thank you. Magda, in one sentence, what's your silver bullet?
I guess it has to do also with job quality standards, but how we set those standards, I think we need to throughout improvement in monitoring measures and evaluation measures within the organization that are not necessarily those given by the designer of technologies, but within organization and employee informed measures of efficiency and not just uptake of different technologies. Yeah.
Jolene, final word on a policy ask from you.
In addition to everything everyone said, because I get to have all of theirs, plus I'm going to say two, but in one line, guidelines for human-centered technology adoption.
Yes.
And a renewed focus on lifelong learning.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to Mark and everyone at the Nuffield Foundation, and to everyone at Digit as well, and for all those who've made this work possible. Really, really great to have everyone here. There will be a recording available for this. Please do go and read those reports and the other reports around that. Fantastic work from Digit. Also the major final publication of the Pissarides review. And yeah, very much look forward to seeing you back on the 26th for the event we have focusing on our work with young people. So thanks so much all.